Hi, Dr. Frame, and welcome to the GI Health Summit. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love talking gut health.
Great. Well, speaking of gut health, why is what we eat important to gut health?
That's a great question. So we all know that when we eat food, it goes into our gut. So it's not a big stretch to realize that what we eat is important for our gut. But why is it important for gut health? And there's basically two parts, right? So we need to feed our body so it can maintain itself. That is the first reason, right? You need to have the building blocks of your gut to maintain it. The other reason is that you have something called a gut microbiome, and that resides inside of you, and it actually eats the food that you can't process. And when it does that, it produces all sorts of beneficial compounds like short chain fatty acids that promote health for you, your gut microbiome, and your gut. The one that I like to point out the most is that short chain fatty acids are actually food for your colonocytes, the cells that make up your gut. And without that, they would actually starve and die. So you need this gut microbiome to eat fiber, produce short chain fatty acids to actually fuel your gut.
So, this concept of microbiome, all the speakers are talking about, but it might be a concept that is new to some people. So, like, where is it? How big is it on the whole gut? How big is it? Can we see it?
That's a great question. So the microbiome as a concept is actually bigger than the gut. So the microbiome is the guts is the bugs that live on us and in us. So they're all over you. They're on your skin. They're in your eye. They're in your gut. They're in your urogenital tract. And they serve a purpose. They've co-evolved with us, and we work together to move through life. And so what we've learned is that these bugs, which can be bacteria, archaea, viruses, things that maybe historically we were a little afraid of because we thought they caused disease. And while some of them do, many of them do not. And they're actually really important for our health or protect us from some of those disease-causing bacteria or viruses or fungi or whatnot. So now that we know about the microbiome, we know that some of the things we were doing was not so healthy. For instance, just antimicrobial everything isn't healthy because we need to have these microbes on us and in us. But we also are learning how to better take care of the microbes that we have. And diet is the number one thing we can do for them.
Wow. I mean, who discovered this? I'm just curious.
Ooh, that's a great question. We've kind of been chipping away at this for a long time, but really the big leap forward was when we discovered next generation sequencing. So we actually could look at the genetics of the bacteria that are there because a lot of them can't be cultured in the traditional way because they can't survive oxygen. So if you take them and you've harvested them from inside the gut, be that a stool sample or if you're having a colonoscopy and they're actually taking a sample, and you put it on these agar plates and try to grow it like you would historically, nothing will grow. And so we didn't know that they were there. But if you just look at their genes and we can figure out who's there based on their genes, now none of that matters. It doesn't matter whether they can't survive oxygen or not. And we've discovered thousands and thousands of species that we didn't know existed prior to that.
That's incredible. Are you familiar with Dr. Semmelweis?
Yes, the name is familiar. I'm drawing a bit of a blank now, though.
So he's the guy that discovered that just by washing hands, there was less death in childbirth because apparently
That's
back in
right.
the day, and he was actually ostracized, you know,
Yes.
and so when I think about him, I'm thinking, we want to have hand washing if we're going to have surgery,
Yes.
obviously. So
Yes.
how do you kill the bad guys and keep the good guys?
That's a great question. So the really good thing about the good guys or the commensal bacteria, as we call them, is that they're really resilient. So if you just do something like wash your hands 3 times a day, they're going to bounce back. For one, you've got some on the lower part of your arm. They're going to travel down and fill that niche, but you're not doing enough to destroy them constantly. Though there is some research showing that daily showers may be too much for the skin microbiome. So there's a fine line between getting rid of the bad bacteria and letting the good ones grow. Luckily, the gut is a little bit easier. We just need to make sure we're giving it the right food, the right fuel, and not putting things in our gut that are going to harm them. So we don't want to be using antibiotics every day. If you need to take them for 7 days, not a big deal. The gut will bounce right back. But if you're on it every day for, say, acne, we don't really know the effect that has in the gut microbiome, and it's probably not good for them.
It wasn't too long ago where people would literally, bathe once a week.
Absolutely. And that's actually not uncommon in many other countries. They always say the United States is kind of obsessed with the bathroom. We have a bit of a fetish with being clean. And it's one of those things that, it's important to be clean, but you can take anything too far, right? Anything, you have too much of it, you can be killed by it. Water will kill you if you have too much, but water is very important for your health. So it's not that you shouldn't be clean, but do you need to really wash your face 3 times a day? Probably not. But lots of people are doing that because they feel like they're not clean, or they have oil on their skin or something that makes them uncomfortable. And it's because they've disrupted that natural ecosystem from all that washing.
You're not the first doctor who said that maybe we are showering too much, but I think about how I love baths personally, and I
Oh,
don't
I'm a
take
bath
that.
person too.
I don't really take them to be clean. I just love soaking in hot water, and I'm thinking, can I not do that every day? Is that going to
Yeah.
help my microbiome?
Yeah, well, I think it definitely depends on what you're putting in your bath. If you've got a big soapy bath, then it's probably going to be more detrimental to them. But if you're doing like an Epsom salt bath, that might actually be good for them.
Yeah, that's actually what I do. I
There you
love
go.
the Epsom salts.
That's what I do too.
I think most people walking around today don't really think much about their microbiome or even necessarily their gut health unless something is wrong. You know,
Hmm.
so how do we impress upon people that they have this, that it's important, and that how they eat really matters in terms of the health of their microbiome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the other element of that is that a lot of people don't understand what is normal for gut health. People think that occasional diarrhea and constipation is normal, and that's actually not true. If you are constipated or having diarrhea, that means something is wrong. And it could be that your diet isn't right, you aren't hydrated enough, or it could be that your gut microbiome is in what we call dysbiosis, or it's in a unhealthy state. And so you need to change what you're doing to get it back to a healthy state, which actually, unfortunately, can be kind of difficult in some cases. For instance, if you develop an IBS, getting back to a healthier microbiome can be really difficult. But they're, under the direction of clinicians and registered dietitians, you can get your gut microbiome back. And in most cases, it's actually just through diet. So diet is a powerful contributor to the health and the composition of your gut microbiome.
When you go to the doctor, he can measure certain things like your blood pressure. He can even do a blood test, he or she, to assess certain markers. But how does one assess their microbial health?
Oh, good question. And this is something I talk with my husband all the time because this is actually what he does. He is setting the standard for how you measure the gut microbiome. And research wise, we have a decent handle on that, but the clinical tests are just not really there yet. And part of that is because the research isn't really there yet. We've been looking at things from a really high level. We have an idea of what family of bacteria are there, for instance, which is similar to saying there are people there. But there's a large diversity within people, right? We don't know if those people are gardeners or if they are preschoolers who are causing havoc. There's a very large difference there. So that's part of it, is the research isn't clear because we haven't gotten enough specificity on the research side. And the technology is coming to make that easier. Once that technology is really firmly in the research, then we can bring it into the clinic. But that's probably 10 years down the line of having a really solid clinical test that, someone particularly without gut microbiome training, right? It's a whole separate field, would be able to read. It'd be nice if you could just go to your primary care physician. There was some tests that they wouldn't have to be an expert in, but they could read the results and say, okay, according to this test, you need to increase your fiber intake, you need to decrease the fat, the omega-6 fats in your diet, and have something that you could actually work with them on. And I do think that's coming. I'm actually working with some people to make that happen in the future, but we're just not quite there yet.
Wow. I wonder how the changing diet in America has affected the microbiome, because I think about the food that we eat today, and Americans eat something like more than 50% of their calories from processed or ultra processed food. And yet when I think about what my grandmother ate, much of that wasn't even around at that time.
Didn't even exist. Absolutely. I think that's a very good point, and it's something that I'm personally very concerned about, because when you think about a processed food, the things that pop into my head are lack of fiber, which we've already talked about. Fiber is really important for the gut microbiome. In addition, other components that we don't know what they do to the gut microbiome, like gums, thickening agents, stabilizers, emulsifiers, preservatives. Many of them may be okay, but there is some preliminary research out that shows that they probably aren't, particularly things like emulsifiers seem to have a detrimental effect, at least on some people's gut microbiome. And if you remove them from the diet, they can actually rebound and their gut microbiome will come back and be healthier again. But as you've pointed out, these foods are kind of everywhere now. So actually doing that can be difficult, right? Pulling those completely out of your diet to allow your gut to heal can be difficult.
I think about the popularity of certain dietary styles like keto or carnivore, and these are fiberless diets. They often take fiber supplements. So I'm wondering what type of microbiome the people that are on these diets have.
Yeah, that's a great point. I am concerned about these people's gut health. I am. Because it's not just fiber, it's about diversity of fibers too, right? So if you're taking a fiber supplement that only has one type of fiber in it, that's not really helping, right? It's kind of missing the point. You need a diversity of fibers because let's put it this way, the number one indicator of gut health is gut diversity, right? How many different gut microbiome bugs do you have there, the different kinds? And the number one indicator for the microbiome diversity in the gut is the number of plants that you eat. So
That's
if you aren't eating a large number of plants, you aren't going to have a diversity in your gut microbiome, which is generally considered to be unhealthy. Um, I don't know how you can have a carnivore diet without plants and have a healthy gut microbiome. Even if you're adding fiber supplements, there's still something missing there from the literature as we know it. Maybe it's possible, but then again, is that really how we want to be eating, that we're getting these components from pills instead of from food? It kind of goes against my take on how nutrition works, is that a minimally processed, plant-based diet is best according to literature, and the gut microbiome just confirms that. They need a variety of plants, and getting them from an actual plant as opposed to a pill does seem to be better. Vitamin E is the one I always point out because we showed that people who ate a lot of vitamin E in their diet were protected from all sorts of long-term diseases. And then we did clinical trials delivering vitamin E in a pill, and it actually was detrimental. So getting your nutrients from food is very different than getting them from a pill. So I'm just concerned that they think they're fixing that problem with this pill, but they may not be, because it doesn't have the same effect as the food as a whole food.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's not just the fiber that's important in plants, that it's doing something else for us.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things you've probably heard about with plants is phytonutrients, or things like polyphenols, and they have been really strongly correlated with health benefits. But what's really interesting is that 90% of those components end up in the gut with the gut microbiome. So we're not really processing them. They're getting down to our gut microbiome and having their effects there. And there's some research showing that without the gut microbiome, we may not even see any of the health benefits from these compounds. It's really coming through the action on and with the gut microbiome.
So everyone has been talking about the importance of fiber, but I don't think anybody ever actually said, what is it and what is it doing?
Good question. So there's two things for fiber. The one that your grandmother told you about, roughage, right? So you need to have bulk formation to keep you regular. That's very important because it's part of your detoxification process. So you need to get everything to move through the gut. You don't want anything stagnating in there. When things stagnate, that's when you have things like an increased risk for colon cancer. So that's why we need roughage. That's why we need fiber. But the other component is that fiber is actually the fuel for your gut microbiome. So it's got kind of a twofold importance. And the really interesting thing is when those gut bugs eat things like resistant starch and they produce short chain fatty acids, that actually also increases your gut motility and makes you more regular. But there is a limit to that because you can have too much of a good thing. You can have gut bugs that make too much short chain fatty acids, and that can actually lead to diarrhea or IBS. So, as with most things in nutrition, it's about balance, right? It's a U shaped curve. You don't want too little, you don't want too much. You want to get somewhere in that sweet spot that makes both you and your gut microbiome happy. And you do have to experiment with that. And the safest way to do that is with foods. Supplements are a lot easier to deliver, a large dose that may cause digestive upset.
How careful do we have to be about the number in types of plants? Because you talked about the diversity is what's really important. So
Hmm.
many people don't eat any fruits and vegetables. I'm trying to think, if you try to get them, if they're eating zero, how are you going to get them to have a diverse
Yeah,
array of them?
yeah, that's a very good point. And I always recommend starting slow, not just because it's going to be hard for the person to change their lifestyle, but actually it's also going to be hard for their gut. You don't want to just shove it into a high fiber diet because you'll have a lot of side effects like gas, bloating. You could actually have constipation or diarrhea from that. So you want to change your diet gradually, and that makes it easier for people to get used to it too, right? So you're just swapping out one thing. So instead of having a bag of, I don't know, sweet tarts or something for your dessert, have some fruit, right? That's one simple thing. We start there. Now you've got more plants in your diet. And once that seems like it's not totally overwhelming, then we start with, instead of having, a cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato and onion on it, we have a really big salad and you have maybe a half a sandwich, right? Where we don't move you too far, but we're moving in the direction of adding more and more variety of plants. And the variety is something that I really am concerned about with the American diet, because even those people who do eat fruits and vegetables, one, they're not getting enough of them, but they tend to eat the same ones over and over again, right? Like if they like broccoli, they eat broccoli like 4 or 5 times a week, which broccoli is great for you. I will never get upset with you eating broccoli. It's fantastic. It's, chemo protected and it's got great qualities, but it does diminish your opportunity for variety. So, it's about balance. And I think reminding us that variety is the spice of life, not just for enjoyment, but also for health.
Oh my God, it's just so, it's like your mind reader, why you pick broccoli, because I get in that rut. I really like it. It's
We
like my
all do.
favorite. And so I eat it almost every day. Well,
Yeah.
today I had turnips, just so you know. So I
There
did
you
have some
go.
variety. So animal products and processed food comprise, I've heard, up to over 90% of the American diet, and neither contain fiber. Is that the reason they can be detrimental to gut health, or is something else going on with those two food groups? And I use the term food loosely.
That's good. That seems to be a large contributor, yes. But there is emerging research that, particularly for the processed food side, that there's more to it than just that because of some of the food additives. Um, with the animal products, interestingly enough, if you have a generally healthy diet and you're getting a lot of fiber, the gut microbiome doesn't seem overly perturbed by those. Because it's got what it needs to be healthy, and if your digestive tract is working properly, you really shouldn't see much of that in the area where the gut microbiome is. It should be digested and absorbed prior to reaching them. Now, if you aren't chewing well, you may end up with some undigested protein, and that's actually really detrimental. The gut microbiome will start degrading that protein and produce things like TMAO, which have been linked to heart disease and colon cancer. And so those are bad. We don't want those. But as long as you are fully digesting, and this is one of those things where the devil is probably in the dose too, right? So if you're not eating a 24-ounce steak, probably much better. Whereas, unfortunately, the average person, when they sit down to have a meal and it has animal protein, has a lot of animal protein in it. So it's not like, oh, they're just having, like in a lot of the blue zones, there is animal protein, but it's used more like a condiment. It's a very small amount, and your body is easily able to digest that. But if you're having these large, massive amounts, you're just not digesting it properly, and it's going to end up in the gut microbiome where they don't really want to see that. And then you can have some negative side effects. Yeah.
So if somebody eats exclusively plants, they don't produce the TMAO?
That is what the research looks like, yes.
Wow. That's cool. So you had a couple of words that I'm not really familiar with. So I'd like to go back a little bit in case the viewers don't know what these words are. You were talking about short chain fatty acids are food for the colonocytes. What are colonocytes?
Yes. So when you have your gut, it's a tube, right? And what makes up that tube are colonocytes. They're these cells that stand like soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, to protect your body from things inside your gut and allow the things to pass that need to pass. So you need to absorb nutrients from your food. It needs to go through these colonocytes, and they kind of act like a sentry saying, this is okay, that's not okay. So if you aren't feeding them with your short chain fatty acids from the fiber, they're going to be weak. And when you have weak sentries, you have things getting past them that wouldn't otherwise get past them. And that's where you may have heard of leaky gut. So a leaky gut is due to these colonocytes not performing at peak function, and frequently that is because they're not getting the fuel that they need to really function properly. There are many other reasons that, for instance, autoimmunity, but if we're talking about the standard American diet, it's really because they're essentially starving and they're doing the best that they can to perform their function, but they don't have the fuel that they need.
You mentioned the short chain fatty acids. Are those produced from the food we eat?
They're produced from fiber. This is why fiber is so important. It's actually a byproduct of the bacteria breaking down these fibers. So they're breaking them down and producing energy for themselves. And this is almost like a byproduct of that. And they use it for some things, but by and large, the short chain fatty acids are used by us. So that's part of our symbiotic relationship with our gut microbiome is we're providing them fiber. They're providing us short chain fatty acids and
So
more.
the short chain fatty acids are foods for the colonocytes, and if they come from fiber and we're not eating fiber, we're not producing these.
Correct. Now, there are other places to get short chain fatty acids, for instance, fermented foods, because that process is going on in the food. So, vinegar has acetic acid, which is one of the short chain fatty acids. Any fermented food will have some short chain fatty acids in there, along with healthy bacteria. And that's probably where a lot of the benefits from those foods are coming from, is from one, giving you more of the healthy bacteria if you're not getting it otherwise, and two, the short chain fatty acids, such as acetic acid.
I'm surprised the pharmaceutical industry hasn't just developed a pill that's your dose of short chain fatty acids.
No, they haven't done that yet, but there are companies working on giving you a pill that would reset your gut microbiome, which I'm all for because that can be hard to do. But the interesting thing is that's only going to get you so far because you're still going to need a healthy diet to maintain it.
Right, because even it's like people that have gastric bypass surgery, they may lose weight, but if they don't continue eating in a healthful manner, they'll gain the weight
Absolutely.
back. So
Exactly. It's just a tool, and a tool is only as good as the plan that it's being implemented in.
that sounds that I don't want to say like cheating, but so literally people take one pill and then it's reset, or is this? I didn't realize they were developing such a medication.
Yeah, so the one that's it just finished phase 3 clinical trials is actually for people that have C. diff, which is largely untreatable at this point. It's typically antibiotic non-responsive, and what they're doing to treat it is fecal material transplant, which is not the easiest thing to do, and we don't know enough about the gut microbiome to really screen it very well. So it's kind of it's a tough thing, but we're doing it because otherwise these people would die. This pill is a much cleaner and safer version of that, essentially.
Do you think that the reason that C. diff has become antibiotic resistance is because people that are consuming animal products like dairy and meat are basically ingesting large doses of antibiotics on a daily basis?
It's hard to say that they have not been actually linked, but we do know that poorly raised meat and dairy, which is a large proportion of what you see in the grocery. If you look at the literature, there are a lot of studies that have shown that there are antibiotic resistant bacteria in those products, or at least on the farms in which those products are coming from. And those farming practices are detrimental for a lot of reasons. So it's pretty safe to say that we shouldn't be eating those things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't necessarily know if that's what's happening in terms of people's gut. We haven't gotten that next step.
Has anyone studied what effect antibiotics have, sometimes people actually, a lot of times people will tell their doctor they want them even when there's no, reason for it. But sometimes people
Yeah.
really have to take them. Do we know what effect that has on the gut and how long it takes if you can't even reset the microbiome afterwards?
Yeah, so luckily it does bounce back from short periods. From what a traditional antibiotic course would be for, say, an ear infection or a sinus infection. It bounces back. And I used to recommend people take probiotics during those just to help, stop any potential diarrhea effects or things like that. But what's kind of changed my mind on that is a study a couple of years ago came out showing that taking probiotics while taking the antibiotics actually slowed the recovery of your microbiome back to normal. So it changed with the antibiotics, and it took longer to go back to what it was prior to antibiotics if you took probiotics. With the caveat that we don't know that what they had before was healthy, right? We don't know if their gut microbiome before was healthy, but just the fact that it slows that recovery now makes me kind of cautious about telling people to take probiotics when they're taking antibiotics.
Interesting. Does it matter the duration or the type of antibiotics? Because I think back to a time when I had a really, really bad UTI and I really did need antibiotics. And the doctor gave me a choice of the traditional ones where you take, I think, 2 a day for like a week or 10 days. And then he said, oh, but we have this new pill and you take it once. And I was scared to take the pill that you take once. Well, also insurance didn't pay. It was like $200. But
Yeah.
now that I know so much about the microbiome, I'm thinking, well, maybe I should have done the one and done if that would have had less detrimental effect on my.
That's really interesting. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that. But the way I would think about it is a low dose over a long period of time would be roughly equivalent to a large dose at one time. Um, so they're probably relatively similar, though it depends on how broad their action is, right? So you have a broad spectrum antibiotic that is kind of like a nuclear bomb. It goes in there and it wipes everything out. Whereas some of the antibiotics actually are much more targeted, and it's only going to take out a certain proportion of that bacteria. And a lot of times you don't have as many side effects with them. I'm definitely less concerned with people taking those than broad spectrum. And generally, people are not trying to give their patients broad spectrum unless they absolutely have to. That's kind of our last resort. So I think the utilization of antibiotics has changed, both on the consumer side. People are more mindful of that, right? You're trying to only take them when you absolutely need them. You know that there are side effects to taking these antibiotics, but also the physicians are really starting to learn about the long-term potential issues with antibiotics, for instance, the gut microbiome, and how do we mitigate that and save our antibiotics for when we really need them, right? We don't want to be creating antimicrobial resistance because at some point we do need antibiotics to treat certain infections.
Right. Is it just oral antibiotics that affect the microbiome? Or, like, for example, sometimes people get intravenous antibiotics in the hospital, or even there's antibiotic creams. Do those
Mm-hmm.
still affect gut health?
So the IV very well may affect gut health. The topical probably won't if you're only using it in a small proportion of your body. So like you have a cut and you're putting a topical antibiotic on that cut, shouldn't have any effect on the gut because it's a very small proportion of your skin microbiome. There is crosstalk between the skin and the gut microbiomes, however. So if you're using, like, I don't know, a full body antibiotic on a regular basis, that's probably not going to be healthy for you or your gut health.
It's so interesting that you mentioned there's crosstalk between the skin and the gut, because we actually have a dermatologist on the summit that's actually addressing that. So thank you for
Ah,
bringing that up.
fantastic.
Yeah. So is it just antibiotics that have a detrimental effect on the microbiome and gut health, or are there other medications, either prescription or over the counter, that we maybe need to be concerned about?
Yes, and that's something that is just starting to emerge because, right, we were just learning about the microbiome, and now we're learning about what messes it up. And certain medications absolutely do change the gut microbiome. Metformin, for instance, um, actually changes the gut microbiome in a very beneficial way. And there's some theory that that may be a large portion of why metformin works in patients that have type 2 diabetes, is it actually changes their gut microbiome to a healthier gut microbiome, allowing them to kind of overcome some of the issues that have been caused by their diet. Now, you could argue that fixing the diet is probably a better way to go than metformin, uh, or perhaps doing both. But yes, there's definitely a role for medications in the gut microbiome. And I think in the future, well, I know in the future, FDA is going to be requiring people to write up information about potential effects for the gut microbiome for their oral medications.
I wonder, it almost sounds like a chicken and the egg kind of thing, because you wonder, like, did the gut microbiome change because of the way that people ate, and then that caused the disease? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
It's like, which way does it go?
Yeah, absolutely. What we do know is our gut microbiomes have changed as a society, and it's gotten worse as recently. So there's something that's changed, but if you look at our society, a lot of things has changed, right? It's diet, it's lifestyle. No one's out there farming, right, and getting the soil microbes. So there's so many things that's changed. It's a little bit difficult to figure out what exact element, and it probably isn't one of them. It's probably all of them that are contributing to this change. Um, Also, non-vaginal deliveries changes the microbiome. If you look at the microbiome of a baby that was born via cesarean section, historically their gut microbiomes looked more like the skin of their doctor than it did of their mother. And for some people that may be protective, actually. There's been some work showing that women who have obesity, if their children are born via C-section, they're actually less likely to get obesity. So there are pros and cons to that. And I think when we have a better understanding of the microbiome in general, we'll be able to figure out how we can move it in a way that would be beneficial from wherever you are, right? You could only do so much, right? If you were born vaginally to a mother with obesity, then you can only do so much.
Yeah,
You
that's
have
me.
to you have to be like spot on it.
That was
Hmm.
me, born, and then, yeah, hurry up.
Yes. Yes. But yeah, the idea is someday we'll have a pill that will help move your gut microbiome away from that obesogenic type so that everything you're doing in terms of eating a healthy diet will be more beneficial.
Okay, like I said, hurry up. So you mentioned bacteria, archaea, and viruses. I think most people have heard of bacteria and viruses, but archaea is a term that's new to me. Can you please explain what that is?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it goes back to when we discovered there was more to this world than animals and plants. We used to think there were basically just everything was either an animal or a plant, flora or fauna. And the bacterial component actually used to be called flora because we thought that they were plants. But that is not true. They're actually their own group. So now we have animals, plants, bacteria, and archaea. And archaea are very similar to bacteria in a lot of ways for the average person to think about them, but they're actually many, many times more numerous than bacteria. There are thousands of more species of archaea than there are of bacteria. So we're just starting to kind of hit the iceberg on archaea, and I think we'll learn more about them. And I think the gut microbiome has largely focused on bacteria because we feel more comfortable with bacteria, we understand it better. But the archaea and then also the fungi and the viruses that are gut microbiome are really starting to have their day in the field, and we're going to learn more about them. And hopefully we'll learn how they're working together, because I think that's really the crux. It's not what bacteria are there, what archaea are there. It's how they're working together as an ecosystem, and whether they are producing short chain fatty acids or TMAO or all these different components, and how that affects your health.
Speaking of health, a lot of people, well, based on what they eat, don't seem very concerned about their health at all. But some people, were concerned about their heart health or maybe their mental health. But I don't see a lot of people, unless they actually have GI problems, walking around being concerned about their microbial health. So how can we impress upon them that this
Mm.
is really important?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's kind of the question for everything in terms of health, is how do you motivate people to care about their diet when they don't seem to care about their health? And in integrative medicine, what we use is motivational interviewing, and that's when you try to figure out what they do care about. So let's say they have grandkids and they wish they could spend more time with their grandkids and run around with their grandkids. Okay, now I've got something that I can motivate them on. Did you know that eating a healthier diet helps your gut be more healthy, and so you can have more energy? And it can also prevent things like diabetes and heart disease. So you'll actually be able to have a longer, healthier life and spend more time running around with your grandkids. That may be a way to motivate someone who doesn't seem to care about their health otherwise, because it's not really about them and their health, right? It's about what they want to do with that health.
That's great. I love that. How do you motivate people to care about their diet when they don't care about their health? That's the $1 million question. I think when it comes to the microbiome in the gut in general, like I say, other things can be measured. And so people can go to their doctor and see right away that their blood pressure is high, right? Or measure that their cholesterol is high. But because really right now can't
Hmm.
be measured in a way
Right.
that, and plus people can't see their microbiome. When people
No.
become overweight, they can see the effect, but they can't really see the effect that the foods they're eating, like animal products and processed food, is having on their gut,
Right.
unless they get a disease.
Yeah. Not until it's much farther along. That's a really good point. Um, the one thing to counteract that is I think that if you slowly move towards a healthier diet, you start to feel the difference, right? So it's getting that first step of moving towards a healthy diet, that's really hard. But once you get moving in that direction, it's not as hard anymore because you're like, oh man, I do have more energy and I don't feel heavy and I don't have brain fog and all of these things. You can notice the difference, but if you've always eaten this diet, you don't know anything else, right? Like you don't know that it feels better to have a salad at lunch than a bag of potato chips because you've always eaten that way. But if you can get people to try it and change it, and maybe it's a 2-week challenge, by the end of the 2 weeks, they're going to know that they were not feeling well because now they are feeling better.
Yeah, got to get them feeling better so they realize how bad they felt.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I had that same experience. I was diagnosed with celiac disease at age 30, and it took me 30 years to figure that out. Um, and I had all these symptoms that resolved, but after I got off gluten, I had symptoms I didn't even know I had because I didn't know any difference. I didn't know I had brain fog because to me that was normal. I was so much sharper afterwards, and I was like, man, I wish I had done this before I did my PhD because then I would have really done well.
Oh, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, sometimes starting just seems to be the hardest part.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, wow. Well, we hope that the people will be motivated with the information on the summit to start somewhere in the direction for their optimal health. You co-authored a wonderful paper with Dr. Laster, who's another expert on this summit. Could you talk a little bit about that research?
Yeah, so that we also talk about fiber in that one too. I get very excited about fiber because it's been taken out of a lot of our foods with the processing. And in this article, we really wanted to look at what has changed about our food since the obesity epidemic really started. And it seems there's a very strong correlation. We don't know for sure that it's the cause, but a very strong correlation that food processing really started when the obesity epidemic started. And it seems that they kind of grew in parallel to one another. So it's not too hard to imagine that if we changed the way we processed our food, or we processed it far less, that maybe the obesity epidemic would be a little bit easier to fight because you'd have things like fiber making people fuller. There's some research showing that the gut microbiome can actually control the hormones that make you hungry, and they actually communicate directly with a nerve to the brain that goes to the gut. So there's this crosstalk that if we could change that, making weight loss easier and actually just making it more natural. You just wouldn't feel hungry all the time because your gut microbiome wasn't sending these signals that I'm starving, because you're giving them the fiber that they need.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
really the take home, I think.
well, fiber is that if for nothing else, even if it didn't have these wonderful effects on the microbiome, I think because that's what the area I work in, weight loss. That is also the key to weight loss is making
Yes.
sure everything you eat has fiber.
Absolutely. Yes, agreed. That seems to be the key for everything. If you look in the literature, the fiber is kind of at the crux of diet. And when we removed it from our diet, we ended up with our current state where almost everyone has one type of chronic disease. Many people have multiple chronic diseases. And how do we fix that? Well, by and large, it's going to be diet and lifestyle.
So it seems like Dr. Dennis Burkett was right after all.
Absolutely.
That is so cool. So, Dr. Frame, what is the truth about GI health?
So GI health is really fundamental. I think that's the way we have to look at it. It'd be like trying to build a house on a crumbling foundation. So if you aren't taking care of your gut, everything else you're doing it's just a band-aid. It's unfortunately true, but it's a Band-Aid. If you haven't gotten your gut health together, you're not absorbing all the great things you're putting inside it, right? You're taking a supplement, and your gut isn't fully functional. Now you have expensive stool, right? Like you didn't really fix the problem. And I think in general that's what we need to focus on. Our health is getting to the root cause of issues. Which often is diet and lifestyle, getting that foundation set, then we can work on other things, right? Then we can try and optimize health. Or if you have some sort of genetic condition or autoimmune disease, then we can help make that better. But you really need to have that foundation. And in a lot of cases, particularly with like autoimmunity, just improving gut health really does improve a lot of the symptoms because it dampens down the inflammation, which seems to be at the heart of all chronic diseases. So if we can get the gut healthy, reduce inflammation, you are really set off for success. It's almost harder to mess it up at that point.
So what diet do you think is best for optimizing our gut health and our health in general?
Yeah, so the literature pretty much says Mediterranean diet over and over and over again, or some version of Mediterranean diet. And to me, that really speaks to a low processed diet because that's what they're talking about when they're talking about a Mediterranean diet. It's foods that you're preparing at home. Another component of the Mediterranean diet is being social, right? So you're with your family, you're prioritizing your eating time, and you're not eating while you're running around. You're actually being present and eating that food. But it's also a mostly plant-based diet. So right, you're not eating a 24-ounce steak every night, or you're not eating I mean, a cheeseburger is the all-American meal, right? A cheeseburger and French fries. There is not a lot of good stuff in that. If you want to have that as a splurge, okay, but it's not a daily food. And unfortunately, a lot of people are eating that as their daily food. So we just need to shift that more towards what do they have in Italy, right? They'd have a nice big salad and maybe a little pasta, and maybe a little bit of charcuterie, but it would be a very small amount. It would be like 1 or 2 slices of prosciutto, which are cut paper thin, as opposed to, oh, I'm having a cheesesteak or a pepperoni pizza or something like that is fairly processed and full of fat and not the healthy fat.
Right. But if we wanted to do it exclusively with plants, that would be good too, right?
Absolutely.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Frame.
Well, thank you.